نصف شبی کجا بودی؟
دختر
در تاریکی کن دقت
منو نمیدونی
چیزی که میبینی
بس چی هستی؟ من بدم
اگه الان یه دونه طوفان میومد، یه دونه طوفان خیلی شدید از پشت اون کوه چیزی عوض میشد؟
I will be sharing some material that's related partly to my book, but some of it is new material. And so I will be discussing this emerging new Iranian horror. And first, I was thinking about going to the elements of the genre and discussing the genre of horror and showing which parts are being, manifested in aspects of the emerging genre. And I will go into examples of the types of films that are emerging in the post-2009 period. So just some of the elements of and conventions of film genre that I just want to quickly discuss is that each genre, as we know, has certain conventions that are properties or features that identify that particular genre. So certain character types that appear, certain props, certain repetition of events and aspects of iconography and archetypes that also are part of that generic convention. And certain elements and formulas and myths that become part and parcel of this kind of larger genre is like, patterns that are developed in stories within that genre. So certain formulas that get repeated and become formulaic and become associated with that genre. And these can be, of course, in terms of the formal and or narrative structure. And some of these generic formulas can be associated with myths and basically myths that are stories that reinforce cultural identities. And then so what's important about genre is that within genre and generic conventions and formulae, there is a certain expectation by audience, a certain kind of like Rousseauian social contract theory about how the genre is deployed and how audiences, being aware about some of those conventions, receive this genre. And of course, some of these generic conventions can be subverted, and that's a whole discussion to be had. But I won't go into that. But nevertheless, there are certain audience expectations, and these basically follow certain conventions and formulas that can either satisfy or frustrate audience expectations. So a generic film can either satisfy or frustrate, our expectations. Certain films constantly seek to do that, of course. And then other aspects of generic expectations seek to show the important role the viewers in determining the genre and the ways that this basically role connects genre to a specific social, cultural, or national environment. And when we get to aspects of Iranian horror, we see that as these aspects become important in relationship to the horror genre in Iran. Of course, audience taste cause genre to change over time, and in the US, in different parts, like science fiction played off of audience fears of invasion, and different genres can play on those fears and anxieties, and certainly in a historical period, and certainly horror genre can be deployed in relationship to a kind of historical fears and anxieties, and they can bring that as a subtext into the generic conventions. So you have largely several forms of the genre. So you have the hybrid genre, a mixed form created through the interaction of different genres. And this is something that's in Iran, like horror comedy, or or comedy horror. This is something that we see often in the Iranian context. So many of the horror films that are produced in Iran often end up being hybrid genres, and I will show which ones sometimes can have this these hybrid genres. And of course you have subgenres, a specific version of a genre, and they can be slapstick comedy or spaghetti western within that specific genre. So they are subgenres. And again, what's important is that the genre appears differently by culture, history, and social contract with the audience. Again, that's kind of specificity aspects that kind of having the larger conventions of the genre, let's say the horror genre, it can still have a specificity in the way it appears within a particular culture and history and audience expectations. And some of the defining characteristics of genres are distinguishing features of the characters and narratives and visual style, and particularly also reflections of their social rituals, and production of certain historical hybrids or subgenres of the generic pattern. So the horror genre, you have certain characteristics that commonly manifest themselves in the horror genre. So for example, certain characters can have physical, psychological, or spiritual deformities. It can have narratives that build on suspense, surprise, or shock. And it also has visual compositions that move between the dread of not seeing and the horror of seeing. So those are certain key elements that often can appear within the horror genre. And then these are some of the horror subgenres. Supernatural horror focuses on a spiritual evil. Many Iranian films also have this element of the supernatural horror, because as I will talk about, they use certain aspects of Iranian myth, folklore, and they deploy that in the service of the story. And so that is a part of the supernatural horror. Psychological horror, this also exists in the Iranian context. Again, some of these are mediated with these other elements. So they may have psychological horror, but then also have supernatural horror, and then sometimes all three. So physical horror, but this physical horror is fascinating because, so for example, we'll talk about it. So this physical horror is showing of graphic violence, right? And this particular subgenre has also been named or called slashers. And it's one of the films that I will talk about that has been discussed by Shahram Mokri as a slasher film, namely Fish and Cat, Mahi o Gorbe. And that's fascinating because so these are certain elements that I wanted to at least itemize. And when I talk about the rest of the films that we will get to, how some of these elements are playing in these films. But what's interesting is the importance of theorizing Iranian horror. Now, as we most likely know, there is a paucity of Iranian horror films in the history of Iranian cinema. It has not been a genre that has been popular in Iranian history, in the production of Iranian films and cinema. But as I'm going to argue, that there has been a new popularity from 2009 onwards that has risen the number of films that are appearing with elements of the horror genre, and as to why this is occurring. So a theorization of why this is occurring at this particular juncture. But an overall theorization is provided by Professor Nafisi, and I think it's interesting to take note of it, because let me just, okay, there we go. So Professor Nafisi says, it seems the case that the absence of certain film genres in a culture may be explained by the unacceptable violation of cultural schemes that these genres produce. One reason for the underdevelopment of the horror genre in Iranian cinema, for example, may be sought in this genre's violation of the etiquette of formal relationships between strangers dictated by the system of ritual courtesy, which requires control of emotions and display of ritual politeness. This system authorizes, even encourages, the display of certain emotions such as sadness, but it prohibits behavior such as frightening someone, rage, and graphic violence against women and children, which are the staples of the horror genre. So effectively, Professor Nafisi believes that there's a certain cultural element, you know, in Iran that has the specificity of ritual courtesy that requires a kind of decorum within the culture that has not allowed for the proliferation of this genre, and how this genre has not, in the long history of Iran, so could kind of to take hold. And this is, we could say, perhaps part of the argument and reasons, but there are other, of course, reasons and circumstances. In my case, in the post-revolutionary period, for example, it's also to do with restrictions in the various periods to do with Ershad. So related to censorship restrictions, particularly on the showing again of violence. And since aspects of violence again is often part and parcel of the horror genre, this has, contravened against the filmmakers trying to make headway in making such films, because they know such scripts would already be found problematic by the by Ershad, by the Institute of Islamic Guidance, which oversees all the production of films in Iran and the scripts and everything. So that's one of the I think major reasons. And so the way that what is important, what is interesting as well, is that new films have emerged that are striving to bypass in a creative way these certain restrictions on showing aspects of what is common to horror genre. And so some of these films have sought to not even show, but imply or have that implication of the horror being present, but without actually showing it. So for example, Fish and Cat, which is based on, it's actually was based on, an actual original story, like an actual real story in the north of Iran, where supposedly a small restaurant was actually killing people and actually using their meat for food in their restaurant. So this is an odd story. It's almost like, it's a kind of a horror version of what Kiarostami did with close-up. So Mokri heard about this story and he decided to make this film, and he calls it a slasher, but there is not one slash in the film. And why is that? Of course, it's partly because of those restrictions, but nevertheless, since he uses these other aspects of subgenres of horror films, like for example psychological horror, he's able to create this sense of doom and impending disaster and violence by just creating that atmosphere, particularly with that circulating one take that is one of the great masterpieces of that particular film. So I argue effectively that this film inaugurated from post 2009. My argument is that this film is one of the catalysts that inaugurates these new emerging horror films. And in terms of particularly its artistic capacity to stand up to and become popular, not just in Iran but outside Iran. So it finds an audience in Iran and finds an audience outside Iran. And then out of this period, even though the film was shown in 2013, there was a few others that were of a lesser quality, but that had started to emerge. But most of the significant films that emerged are post 2013, so it's post Fish and Cat. But there are certain elements that many of these films start to have in common. And also what's important is that I should add that there are also horror shorts that are appearing. So among the feature films that are appearing, there's also a good number of shorts. So these shorts are also indicative of the interest in horror and various aspects of horror and subgenres of horror, in both short in animation and then also just regular shorts, as a kind of a realist short, let's say, not an animation. And so my theorization is largely has been to do with Mark Fisher's, and the reason why I have theorized the uncanny between the weird and the eerie, what I call the uncanny between the weird and the eerie, that kind of is the idea of the weird and eerie theorized by Mark Fisher. I won't go into that right now, but this is something to do with the reason why I go into the concepts of the weird and the eerie and the psychoanalytic concept of the uncanny, is because some of these elements can also cross over to certain aspects of Perso-Arabic literature, particularly the weird and the eerie. And maybe I will read aspects of that perhaps for you. So basically what we have in terms of the uncanny between the weird and eerie is that, according to Fisher, the weird and eerie are two distinct modes, and there's this common logic that structures them both, namely the logic of the strange and the outside. And he basically says what the weird and the eerie have in common is a preoccupation with the strange, not the horrific. And the reason so not the horrific is what is important is because in Iranian context, these films cannot portray terrifying and horrific scenes. So since they cannot portray the conventional aspects of that violence and horror, predominantly, structuring the generic conventions of horror, these films they no longer stay fully grounded in horror as such, but they lead into what we, it can be theorized as the weird and the eerie. So what I do is I correlate the weird and the eerie through a theoretical short circuit to the two modes that Fisher theorizes, found in Perso-Arabic literature, particularly in 1001 Nights, which was, as we know, was based on a lost Middle Persian or Pahlavi pre-Islamic Sasanian period called Thousand Tales or Hazar Afsan or Hazar Afsaneh, and of course itself being also related to an older Indian compendium. But the two terms that I correlate to the weird and the eerie is ajib wa gharib. And these two terms can be kind of through a kind of modified, poetic transcription to the weird and the eerie. So ajib and gharib are the weird and the eerie. And this, of course, ajib gharib has a long history in not just in 1001 Nights and the stories that have these kind of elements that have supernatural elements, that have kind of elements that actually inspired romantic and Gothic fiction. So Antoine Galland, when he first translated the 1001 Nights in 1704, we didn't really have we didn't even have properly the romantic movement, and we hadn't even had Gothic fiction. So in a way, most scholars can and do recognize that the emergence of the Romantics and is partly related to the world created through this literary translation of the 1001 Nights, and also the Gothic fiction, which is heir to much of what today's horror has come about, from people who contributed to the Gothic fiction like Edgar Allan Poe and others, and Mary Shelley, and of course Bram Stoker's Dracula. All of these are Gothic, and in a way all can have their sources in a way to 1001 Nights. By the way, Edgar Allan Poe even actually alludes directly to 1001 Nights. So ajib wa gharib is something that is part of the heritage of in the literary imagination of Iran, and it is part and parcel of certain ideas and concepts, particularly folkloric concepts that are prevalent in Iranian culture, like jinn and so on, that begins to appear into, of course, these films. So I've talked about Fish and Cat, which I think is the inaugurating film of this genre. I mean, these emerging films. And another film that is the same film by, it's another film by Mokri. It's actually important. So I think that what is important is that, this film also has a kind of vampires, and it's very, appropriate in relationship to the, atmosphere that this claustrophobic, paranoiac, socio-political atmosphere after the 2009 protest movement. And so what I'm arguing is that these new emerging films are alluding, using horror tropes and motifs to allude to this socio-political atmosphere after the 2009 protest movement, which was subsequently violently put down, and then this fear and anxiety in the society that emerged begins to influence these new films, and these new films are in a way commenting on this new social, political, historical context in the post-2009 period. If I can play this by Mokri, Mokri is in a way, in his broken English, alludes to this, what I'm talking about. So I hope you can hear this.
Movies are my favorites.
Okay, so
This subject in my movie, Apocalypse, is apocalypse movies are my favorites, and also my scare movies. I like them, and vampire movies, and I put all of them in the mixer and turn on it for this movie. And I think this movie is very same Iran atmosphere in Iran in these days. You don't rely.
Okay. So this film, let me just read this for you. The post-apocalyptic crime vampire film Hujum, Invasion, fits within these coordinates of the uncanny between the weird and the eerie. Since the setting, basically the setting of the film is in a stadium engulfed in perpetual darkness. So the world is in perpetual darkness. There are men with strange tattoos who are engaged in a sport that remains unseen and not unnamed. After the discovery of a body in the stadium, the police have mysteriously already identified the murderer. There only remains the circumstances of the crime, which has to be reconstructed in order for the case to be put to rest. But it is here that the true killer and his teammates want to make advantage of the reconstruction to commit another murder. The would-be candidate, the twin sister of the victim, who is thought to be a vampire. However, in the midst of the reenactment of the murder, the team players forget their supposed roles, and chaos ensues, and the characters are caught in an endless loop in which events repeat themselves in slightly different ways. As the write-up for the film in Mir-Djalali states, the disquieting feeling that time is dissolving, that past and present and future are becoming one, and the history has become halted, is likely to strike a chord with how many young Iranians feel about their lives. Shahram Mokri's intimate drama ominously interviews place, space, and time in the stadium's labyrinthine corridors to a dark allegory. And indeed, both Fishing Cat and Invasion evoke the dark, menacing, and threatening atmosphere of post-2009 Iranian society. So I think that with Mokri, this is much more conscious. So his deployment of horror tropes is a way to create a social political critique of the current state of society in Iran. And this is something that I think is important and new with some of these films. And that doesn't mean that all of the horror films fall within this kind of political critique, but it depends on each film. Each film has to be sometimes analyzed on its own. So let's. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, of course, this is a film I analyzed, and I put this film, this diasporic film, and another diasporic film, which is actually Babak Anwar is Under the Shadow, also within this emerging new horror, that it has a transnational character. So I'm not going to go. One thing I can say is that perhaps quickly is that there are certain elements that I want to say that these films can have in common, certain features, and I will delineate those a little bit perhaps to help with understanding that certain aspects of these films, how they can be, why do we kind of see all of these films in a way, why should we see them in some ways all in relationship to this from 2009 to, let's say, 2020. So basically I say what distinguishes and characterizes the films of this new film movement that I have called the uncanny between the weird and the eerie is their evocation of the menacing atmosphere of post-2009, and again, which includes the diasporic and exilic films, like A Girl and Under the Shadow, and a number of thematics that they commonly share. For example, among the various components shared by these films and to be discussed are such motifs as a political and ideological critique through the deployment of supernatural elements or occult phenomena, such as devil, Satan, vampires, jinn, Al, and Zar. So some of those folklore elements. They also touch on such taboo subjects as female and male sex and sexuality, homosexuality, and queerness in Iran. What's interesting is that I think Hujum is a case in point that also deals with, let's say, homosexuality or queerness in Iran. At the same time, they are often pervaded by doubles or doppelgangers, dreamlike worlds, nightmarish landscapes, paranoid and menacing atmospheres, invisible and threatening forces, and a sense of pervading fear and terror or impending doom. Some of these thematics appear in the film form or style, which shares certain formal features with the universal German expressionism and film noir. So, for example, certain aspects of course, of The Girl has these aspects, particularly German expressionist heritage, and includes the techniques of contrast of light, dark, and shadows, and evokes a sense of mystery, dread, and existential angst, and a sense of moral corruption and crime. These are evident especially in the use of colors, light and darkness, in the mise-en-scène, setting and object spaces, and camera techniques such as strange, unbalanced, off-angle shots like Dutch angles, and so on. So certain formal features and narrative structures and storylines and supernatural and particularly folk horror like Zar, like Al, like Bakhtak, appear in these films. And again, though they cannot sometimes be as horrific as a diasporic film like Under the Shadow is, which is a full-on horror film because it was made outside Iran and could kind of deploy the entire arsenal of horror conventions, whilst in Iran, that is not possible. So this is the figure of the nightmare, which I argue is partially, perhaps even I argue is that unconsciously coded into the chador-clad female vampire, particularly as its heritage and how the nightmare itself is a figure that bleeds into the figure of the vampire. And this is something I've talked about in my, and this is the iconography of Fasuli, and you see it in the cinematic vampire often. So the nightmare is equated often within the cinematic iconography, and in Dreyer's great film Vampire, and again in Coppola's film. And then, there's moments of gesturing it even in A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, where someone is sleeping and she comes to feed on him. So this nightly, demon, so-called the nightmare, right? The figure of the nightmare, Bakhtak Kabus, is unconsciously being coded into, because of the heritage of the cinematic vampire, into the figure also of the girl, the nameless vampire in this film. And what's interesting also is that there's, the aspects of, veiling and chador appear, and in the two films, the veiling of a kind of in particular, jinn in Under the Shadow is different, but nevertheless, the figure of the veiled figure is interesting, that it has this kind of ambiguity that can be deployed. And it even goes back to another film they call Shab 29, Night of the 29th, where also a female figure who is called Al, again, the nightmare, appears at night in the roof. And that figure, in a way, is again a figure of a demonic threat. And so the folklore of Al, I'm not going to go into it, but I've discussed it in my book. It's too long. So Zar is another important element, again, is of folklore that has appeared particularly from the south. And this is an important, Zar is an important aspect of bringing aspects. And by the way, Zar also exists. So Zar is malefic wind that is part of the religious culture of the south, which has its heritage from the African communities that were taken and brought to the south of Iran. And that culture and the religious heritage of that African exilic community survives in that part of Iran, and it has been used in cinema, particularly in Tagwai's film, Bad Jinn, called which is a kind of ethnographic film, or Wind of the Jinn. And so from that period, and also you can see it in Beizai's film, but they're not used. So that's an ethnographic documentary, Tagwai's documentary, and then you have Beizai using it in his film Bashu. So you have the references to Zar in Bashu, but they're not deployed in terms of horror. But in 2016, and Under the Shadow deploys Zar Malefic Wind in terms of its horror deployment. And then same thing in this film by Nima Farahi. So this is an aspect of the use of these called supernatural elements within the culture that are being used from the Iranian context in these horror films. Atomic Heart is an interesting film. This is a kind of psychological horror. Again, certain elements like Satan or the devil are alluded to by being a person who is there, but these are political deployments of these supernatural figures. So this film is fascinating because it's not a typical horror film, but it contains elements of horror genre, and particularly psychological, like a subgenre like psychological horror. I've written a whole chapter of this in my PhD dissertation, and theorized it again in light of the weird and the eerie. This is another film, A Dragon Arrives, by Mani, which again uses these elements of the Iranian culture and literature also, by evocation again of jinn. So jinn often have jinn appears often in these films, but it doesn't literally appear. It's an actual absent presence, so the camera never shows a jinn, for example, in this film, but it evokes it. And what's fascinating about this film is that also it has a textual intertextuality with Bahram Sadeghi's collection of short stories called Malakut. So what's fascinating that many of the book itself appears in one of the characters who's reading this collection in the film. And the film is called, using an intertextual reference to this film, and what's interesting is even within the poster iconography, the color scheme even appears as the same as the cover of the book published in Persian. So you look at the reds and the yellows, and you have the reds and the yellows even in the publication. So the book appears in the film, and it also, so there's elements of being inspired by this book, which has these supernatural elements, and also using aspects of folkloric Iranian culture like jinn and so on, and has some aspects of magic realism and surrealism, and so does this film. So this film again is hybrid. It's not quite a horror, but it uses certain elements of horror to, you know, evoke a sense of menace and dread, and it also has a certain element of, again, a political critique, a kind of critique of aspects of, you know, the current society. Perhaps one of the more successful, again, new films that have emerged is The Night. The Night is very fascinating because it was made outside of Iran. It was actually shot in America. So basically, the trend of making horror films within the transnational circuit continues with this new film called Shab, or The Night, directed by Kurush Ahari. It was just released recently in January 29 in 2020, and the film went into production in the US in 2018 and was mainly shot in America. And it stars Shahab Hosseini as well as Newshah Jafarian in lead roles. And this film, again, is, I believe, using certain horror tropes to comment on aspects of Iranian culture, particularly the social political context and what is happening within that, within this period in Iran. And what's fascinating is also it uses, I'm not going to show the trailer, but it also has a veiled figure. And here you can see this veiled figure. But the iconography of a chador-clad veiled figure seems to become kind of permeating certain aspects of these films. So particularly in the diasporic film. So this film was actually given permission to be shown in Iran, which is, you know, has never been done. A movie that was made outside of Iran that was given permission to be screened in Iran. So I'm coming to the end of my talk, but I'm not going to talk about Skin. This is a complicated film, but this is an important film to talk about in the larger discussion. It's a film that's in Turkish, in Azeri. So my original mother tongue, so it's fascinating that it has an actual subtitle in Persian. So it's entirely in English, but subtitled in Persian. But it has, again, these folklore elements that uses also concepts of jinn and the occult and the occult sciences, and very, very interesting elements that, you know, come fantasy, horror, and drama. Last film I want to talk about is Zalava, which was actually recently made. Also a film that was again particular to a region in Iran. So it was made in the Kurdistan region in a village which is called Zalava, and it also has this supernatural horror element, particularly the film starts, but this is again a hybrid genre. It's a film that has comedy and horror. So, and the comedy is black comedy. Now, this film, I want to show you the trailer for. I'm not sure how many people have seen it, but let's look at it quickly.
فقط تیر منو میزنی. بذار جن به بدن من بمانه. این جن هنوز منکوب نشده. نظر این گربه سمت این شیشه و این کیسه بره.
باید بگی دوست دارم.
چرا نیاجنی شدین؟ آره باشید میگم آره باشید بذار زمین نظری میزنم داش آدم های خرافاتی آزارشان فقط به خودشان نمیرسه برای همین مردم خطرناکه
So, as you see, again, the concept of the jinn or the idea of the jinn is one of the predominating supernatural horror dimensions that permeates the film. But what's interesting is that since this film is, again, localized within the Kurdistan and within the period of the post, just before the revolution, 1978, it has certain critiques that are, from that period, but I think more also to a new 2000 post 2020 world. So it can have both aspects of a kind of historical specificity and cultural specificity, but also a broader relationship to Iranian culture and society. But it may no longer, this film may no longer be within the coordinates of the weird and the eerie, according to my theorization, and it may be the beginning of, but it continues the trend of the new Iranian horror genre. So the trend is set that, and filmmakers such as Arsalan Amiri, who's a Kurd, who's actually a writer, who's made several scripts, helped with Aida Panahande, they are spouses as far as I know, and Aida Panahande, as we know, has this trilogy of films, particularly with in the north, with the important female centered roles like Nahid, Esrafil, and the recent, again, 2020 TT. And TT is interesting because Arsalan Amiri is also a co-writer in that film. And also he has several co-writers for this film. But in that film, he's a co-writer with Aida Panahande. And in that film, you get a kind of supernatural dimension relationship to a figure of the gypsy, a Koli, in Iran, right? Who's also considers themselves a witch, right? And so a jadugar. And so these supernatural elements are put in there, but that film, Titi, is not really an actual horror film. But what's interesting is that it seems that these elements of folklore and supernatural ideas are becoming prevalent in cinematic productions of this period, and I don't know at how long this can continue, because there are certain pushbacks by the government again in relationship to these types of films, and so it remains to be seen again. But I think if the doors are allowed to be open, we may be able to see more horror genre type of films or hybrid horror genres emerging from Iran today. And so I think with that, I will, conclude my talk. Thank you so much.